Hello everybody, and welcome to Artists for Everyone. And today I am fulfilling a special request for a lady slipper. And I decided to do it. I don't know if we're even all familiar with lady slippers, but they're a type of orchid that does grow here in Western New York. And there are many varieties of them. But I thought it would be a fun thing to try for a couple reasons. It will teach us about creating volume and doing some special effect work, and also about creating colors that we don't have on our palette. And the lady slippers that I know have a very bright magenta color, and I don't have that in my palette. I don't even know if it exists in a mineral or gemstone pigment. Maybe rhodonite would be the closest thing, but we don't have it in our palette. So what I would do is I would mix something as close as possible, and we can do that using the Bois Rose and the Wood Violet. And we'll get something that has sort of a pinkish purpley look to it. It's going to be a little bit paler than it would be for the vibrant magenta. But there are many, many kinds of lady slippers, and there are several different colors of lady slippers. So mostly we're going to be working with the shape, and I'm going to use my Strathmore watercolor postcards. And I have a number 2 pencil and my 000 squirrel mop. You could use any pointed round in like a size 6, as long as it has a nice point to it. I have an eraser. I have a little palette. I have my beautiful Wildthorne Artists for Everyone paints. And if you don't have these or want to use other watercolors, I leave substitutions for all of these colors in the description box below the video. So we will get started with our drawing first. And this drawing, I'm going to try to do it a little darker because many of you say you can't see the drawings very well, and I'm going to try to hold it up so you can see it. But we're going to start by drawing a little bit of an egg, kind of an oval shape, I guess I would say. And I'm going to draw it right about here in the center. So hopefully that's dark enough that you can see. So it's just an oval. And then above the oval, I'm going to draw a petal shape. And the petal shape is sort of like a teardrop, okay? And then I'm going to draw one coming out this way. And I'm going to draw another one coming out this way. So let me show you this so far. So I've got an oval and then 3 teardrop shapes that are petals. So there's 3 petals coming off that we can see. Okay? And then I'm going to draw at the top of this oval just a little rectangle. And then the rectangle, at the top of the rectangle, I'm going to draw another oval, sort of like that. So let me lift this up. So I've got this little sort of rectangle shape here without the end on it, and then I drew another oval on the inside. All right? And then we're going to draw a leaf. We're going to start up here, and I'm just going to draw a pointed leaf that kind of comes down. And it's hidden behind the flower, but then it picks up down here and comes down like that. Okay, so that is all we're going to draw. Let me hold this up for you. Hopefully you can see that. I hope. Okay? All right, so normally, especially when I'm drawing paler flowers, I don't want such dark pencil lines. And I want to take my eraser and just sort of lighten them up a little bit so they're not terribly dark. And so I'm just using a stick eraser and just lightly rubbing over my pencil lines. These petals are very pale, almost white. So I don't want that dark pencil line. And we're using pinks and yellows and purples, and those are typically more staining. And so once they're down on the paper, it becomes almost impossible to erase those pencil lines. Okay, I'm going to brush off the eraser dust. So I'm going to show you this one more time as it's lighter. Okay, they're pretty simple shapes. And I want to talk a minute about painting things that look difficult to us. Like, we know that the front part of the lady slipper orchid is like a bowl. It's like an egg-shaped bowl with an opening, and then the petal tucks inside, and it looks really difficult. But we have to remember that all we're doing when we're painting, we're not thinking of it as a flower or even a petal or a stem. We're thinking of it as different shapes of color next to one another. And so if we think of it that way, it makes it a lot easier. All right? So I'm going to grab some water here. And we're going to start with the hardest part. We're going to start with the bowl, little bowl shape on the orchid. And I'm going to mix up some of the wood violet in my palette. And I want it to be nice and fluid. And then to that, I'm going to add just a touch of the water rose. A little bit more. That's about as close as I'm going to get to the lady slipper color with this palette, and that's fine. Add a little bit more and see what happens. Yeah, I think that's good. Okay, so we're going to start by putting a water glaze on this outer portion of the egg shape. So not inside the cavity, but around here. And I'm just going to put a water glaze down. And I'm being very careful about my edges, just because I don't want to go inside that cavity yet. So I got water down. I'm going to dry my brush off, and I'm going to move my brush around because I don't want any pooling of water. I want it to be a nice, smooth, even glaze. And I just keep drying my brush off and just kind of mopping up the water and making sure my glaze is nice and even to the edges. Okay. So now I'm going to pick up the wood violet water rose mix, and I'm going to drop it around the inside edge. I'm just going to move my brush along the inside edge. Now it's interesting because I'm putting a little more wood violet in there and make it a little bit darker. Because we have the water rose mixed into it, the wood violet is a little shyer. It's not whooshing as much as it normally does because it's got the other pigment holding it back. And that's fine. So I'm just putting it along the inside edge, right up to that part where the other petal meets it with that little rectangle. And then I'm going to grab just some of the water rose and a tiny touch of that wood violet to make a lighter color. And I'm going to go around the outside edge. And I'm just trying to leave a little bit of white space in between down here. I'm going to rinse my brush and roll it to a point, and then use the point of my brush to make sure my edges are nice. I'm going to take a little bit more of the wood violet while it's still wet and just go around that inner edge one more time. And it'll start to encroach and kind of move out. And once again, just running my brush along the edge to make sure that my edges are nice. Okay, now the lady slipper has, how do I want to say, let me just, hold on. It has some lines through it. So I want to take my clean dry, I had an Amber Alert on my phone, it scared me. So I'm just taking the tip of my clean dry brush and I'm just swiping it through. And it gives a little white line, excuse me. And the lines kind of curve out and down. And that's it. That's all I want to do. Okay, so while this is still drying, I want to take some more of my wood violet mix, and I'm going to put it just on the inside, down the side of that rectangle, and move it around just on the inside. I'm not taking it all the way, but almost. See, I went down the sides of that rectangle and brought it in, cleaning my brush, drying it off. And then I'm going to take my clean dry brush and I'm just pulling it through the paint into that bowl. So you can see. So I just put a little bit around the edge and then I pulled my brush through to kind of make the paint sort of go down and into this toward the center all the way around. All right, and those brush strokes give us the illusion of the bowl curving in. And then I'm just going to pick up some mimosa, just a little bit, and I'm going to put it in the center of that rectangle and down into the bowl. Dry my brush and just sort of spread it a little bit. You see how pale that is? It's pretty pale. So the mimosa on that little rectangle piece and then down into the bowl of the flower. And that's all I need to do for right now. So what is giving us the effect that it's going down is the direction of our brush stroke. So I want you to look at that again. You see that? They're going down, down and toward the center. Okay. So this is a little bit fussy and it does take a little practice. So don't worry, you will get it. All right, now I'm going to go ahead and move up to the top petal. And I'm going to be using the wood rose and the mimosa. But first, just like always, I'm going to put a water glaze down. I shouldn't say like always, but whenever we're doing petals that we have subtle color variations, we're going to start with a water glaze. I'm putting some in the middle, and then I'm using the tip of my brush to sort of move it to the outer edge. And just make sure that it's a nice even coat. And then I'll stop here at the bottom when I get to that rectangle. I'm going to grab some of the wood rose and put it in my palette so it's nice and pale. And I'm going to start at the tip, and I'm just going to move it around the edges, just dropping it in around the edges. And then I'm going to pick up some of my mimosa, put it in my palette, and I'm going to start here, and I'm just going to bring it up the center a little bit. Clean my brush, roll it to a point, dry it off, and then I'm going to use the tip of my brush to just swipe through, starting at the bottom and moving out toward the edges. And then the tip of my brush will go around the edge of the flower petal, making sure that my edges are as nice as possible. And that's all we're going to do for the petal at this point. And then I'm going to do the same thing to the other two. So I'll turn my paper. See how pale this is? It's a very pale flower. Bringing the water glaze right up to the center orchid piece, but not over it. We don't want them to touch really. Bringing it down, drawing my brush off, and using the tip of my brush to move that water glaze out to the edges of the petal. Remember, if the edges aren't perfect, we always have that moment to clean up our edges. Grab the wood violet, the water rose. Pull it around the edges all the way to the tip. Grab some mimosa. Let it spread out a little bit. My mimosa had a little water rose in it. Clean my brush, roll it to a point and dry it off. And then I'm going to go around my edges first. And then dry my brush off again. I keep drying it off because I don't want water in my brush, and I'm just going to pull my brush through from the center to the edges. And that just, all that does is sort of smooth everything out and let the paint flow in the right direction. So there's two petals. And then we'll do the last one, same thing. Water glaze first. Dry my brush off a little bit, and then use the tip of my brush to move the water glaze to the edge. So remember that these projects are meant for the very beginner watercolorist, someone who feels like they could never paint a flower. And I'm here to show you that you can, and it might take you 3 times, but you'll get it. We don't sit down at the piano and play anything on the first try. We have to practice a little bit. So putting my water rose around the edges, all the way down to the point. And then my mimosa down the center. Clean, dry brush. And I'm going around the edges. I just keep drying my brush off to make sure, number one, that it has a nice point, and number two, that it doesn't have too much water in it. And then just running my brush through just to sort of soften everything. So now the petals have one layer on them, okay? So I think at this point, I think we can add one more layer to the outside of the bowl. So I'm going to pick up that wood violet mix again, and I'm just going to go around the very edge of the bowl. The outside edge, not the inside edge. Using the tip of my brush. Clean my brush off, roll it to a point, and then just using the tip of my brush, I'm just wicking it through to sort of soften it and give some of those little lines. Clean my brush off again and just soften those edges with a clean, dry brush. Okay. Now, see, I'm just softening everything, making sure my edges are nice. Now, here's the other thing. This is a very simplified version of a lady slipper. A lady slipper is a pretty complicated flower, and I'm breaking it down into the simplest terms here. If you have some experience with watercolor, I suggest trying this first and then find an image of a lady slipper that you can sit down and do a seeing drawing exercise where you're really looking at a specific flower and trying to capture it on paper by really seeing it with your eyes. So if you have a little bit more experience, that would be a great thing to do. So I do have to let this dry now. As soon as it dries, we'll come back and we'll put a layer on the leaf, and then we'll let that dry, and then we're going to try to remove more of the pencil lines. Okay, so get this far and then let it dry, and then we'll be back. Okay, so this layer is now dry, and we're going to put a layer on the leaf. So let me show you how it looks when it's dry. Can you see that? Okay, it's pretty pale. So we're going to mix up a nice warm green, and I'm going to take the Viridian, put it in my palette, rinse my brush, and take some of the Mimosa and just warm it up a little bit. And I'm just going to paint the leaf. I'm going to be very careful. So I'm going to start at the tip and go right up to those pencil lines and just pull my paint down. I try not to go over the paint twice because I want a nice even glaze of this green, but I'm just pulling it down with the tip of my brush. And then when I get to the petal, I turn my paper a lot. I'm going to go right up next to it as best I can. See how I'm using the tip of my brush for this. Just continue filling in the leaf with this beautiful warm green. This Viridian is so gorgeous. And then you can warm it up a little bit by just adding a bit of Mimosa, that nice cool yellow. It's a beautiful green. It has lovely granulation. So I'm going to take some more And then I'm going to go around this area with the tip of my brush. And again, if you ever feel uncomfortable the way your brush is on the paper, you can move your paper to make it more comfortable. It's one of the benefits of working small. You can move your paper a lot. And I'm just bringing it down the stem. Okay. Now, if my edges don't look great, I can clean my brush and roll it off, and just like always, use the tip of my clean, dry brush. Just smooth those edges if I need to. But I think that looks pretty good. So now I want to do a little bit of work on the inside of the bowl. And what we're going to do is we're going to take the mimosa and put it in our palette with lots of water. Okay, so it's nice and pale. And I'm going to add just a touch of the buff Titane to sort of mute it out a little bit. Make it kind of creamy. Again, there's another color by Daniel Smith called Titanium Buff or Buff Titanium, and there are also suggestions in the description box on how to make that color. And I'm going to paint the inside of the bowl, avoiding the yellow stem there, that little yellow rectangle. See, I just put a glaze of that inside. That's it. It's very subtle, but it just sort of kind of enhances it and brings it all together there. And then while the green is drying, I don't want to touch this outer portion, but I can work on these two petals a little bit. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to wake up that lighter water rose with a little bit of wood violet in it. Get some on my brush, and I'm just going to go around to the edge of the petals. All the way to the point. Just to give them a little definition. Clean my brush, dry it off, and then just lightly soften that inner edge of where we put it. It's pretty pale, but we still just want to soften it a little bit. And I'm going to go around all three petals and do the same, because I just want them, if I'm near green, I want to make sure I don't touch it, okay? So again, this is fiddly because you're using the tip of your brush and you're trying to be very precise in where you put the color. So it takes a little practice to get a sure hand. And one tip, now I'm cleaning my brush, drying it off, and I'm just softening with my clean, dry brush that edge of the color I just put on. So one tip that I have is that I anchor my hand on the table. I anchor it. Now I'm going to do the last one. Just taking it all the way around the edge of the petal. And you notice I put it a little bit around here, and I'm just going to surround that little stem. Clean, dry brush, and then just soften everything on the inside edge. There. I'm going to hold this up for you so you can see it. I'm going to stand up to make sure I'm getting it in the camera. Do you see that? So I just rimmed the outer edge in that paler water rose with a touch of the wood violet in it. Okay. Now, I really do have to let this dry one more time, and then we can just get to business after that. All right, so let yours dry, and then we'll be back. Okay, so I think this is dry now. And let me see here. What we're going to do first is we're going to try to erase any pencil lines that we have. So I just have a kneaded eraser. Let's get a little clean section. And I'm going to take the eraser and I'm just going to go around the edges and see if I can't get up some of that extra graphite. And it isn't all coming off, but a lot of it is. And so that's okay. All right. So I'm happy with that. Okay. So now we're going to do some of the little details on our flower. And we're going to start with the leaf, and I'm going to wake up that green mix. And I'll start down here, and anywhere the flower hangs over the leaf, there's going to be a little bit of a shadow. And there's also a little bit of a stem line, a vein. So right up next to the bowl of a flower and right under the petals, I'm going to put some of this green. And then I'm going to bring it down like this to where the stem, the leaf meets the stem, and I'm going to pull the green down on one side of the stem. And then I'm just going to clean my brush and dry it off, and I'm going to soften. I can just take my brush and just lightly soften it. And I can pick up more of the green because it's all wet now, and I can just drop it in underneath where the petals hang over the leaf. Down here towards the stem, and then down one side of the stem. Roll my brush off, and again just soften anywhere that I need to soften. So that just gave our green a little bit more dimension. We don't want to do too much. This is a very simple rendition, okay? But we do want to add a little bit. I can even go in with a tiny bit more and just touch it to the top here where the flower hangs over. And as it dries, it'll sort of seep in and it'll look great. And I'm going to do the same thing on this side. So I'm going to wake up the green, get some on my brush, and anywhere that it meets the flower, I'm going to put a little extra green using the tip of my brush and just moving it around. And then right down the center to the tip. And again, cleaning my brush and drying it off. And I just soften it. So by softening, I mean I'm taking that hard edge that I just painted and pulling my brush over it just to soften that edge and sort of blend the two, the light and the dark, together. And then I can pick up more of the green because it's wet. The paint is wet, and I can drop more of the green where I want it darker. I'm really sorry, my phone just rang and it kicked me off again. I didn't know it did that. But I dropped in a little bit more green around the edges, and then I just continue to soften and make sure my edges are nice. So you see, it just gives it a little bit of interest. All right, we don't want to do too much because the leaf is not the focal point, but we do want that nice green leaf in the background. And then once that's done, I'm going to take just a tiny bit more of the green. And again, I'm just going to pull that vein down, just so it has a little bit. And then I'll do the same here. I'll start at the tip, and it's just going to kind of disappear behind that flower. Okay. All right, so the leaf is done. Now we're going to move to that center bowl, and we're going to add a little bit to that. So I'm pretty happy with how it looks, but I do want to emphasize that it goes behind this little stem here. So I'm going to take a little bit more of that mimosa and a little bit of buff Titane to creamy it up. And then I'm going to just take a tiny, tiny bit of that wood violet mix and add it in there. And it'll sort of make a murky yellow. Let me see if you can see that. So just something really pale and murky. Even gray would be fine. And I'm just going to emphasize the sides of that little rectangle that's sticking down. See, I'm just adding a little bit of dark to the top of the bowl around those sides. And just pull it down a little bit. Rinse my brush, clean it off, and if I need to soften, I can, but it really should be pretty distinct. So if you can see that. I just emphasized, put a little bit of that murky yellow color on either side. You could also use a really pale wash of wood violet, some gray, anything just to sort of darken that up a little bit, okay? And I think I'll bring it down a little bit more. There. And I'm going to do the same thing at the edges where it starts to turn in. I'm just pulling a little bit of that around the edge where it starts to turn in. And then I'm going to do the same down the sides on the outside. So I'm leaving a little bit of white space. And then I'm using little short strokes just to sort of darken the outer edge of the bowl where it meets the inner edge. See that? Just a tiny bit. And I'm going to do the same thing again along the very bottom edge. Just a tiny little bit right before it meets the green. And what that does is it gives the illusion that it's curling backwards from us, because anytime something goes away from us, it gets a little darker. So I'm just adding a little bit of that sort of pale gray or murky yellow to the bottom. All right. And then on the petals, where they come down, I want to do the same thing. So let's just take a little bit more of the wood violet mix, and we're just going to add a tiny bit of the mimosa to it to sort of gray it out. You can see that. So purple and yellow make gray. So it's very pale. Do you see how pale that is? And anywhere that the flower goes in to meet the other petals, and anywhere that it's coming out from under the bowl, I'm going to put that color, dry my brush, and just soften. So I can add a little bit more, just drop in a little bit more where the petal goes in and under. And I'm going to do the same thing over here. I'm going to pick up some of that pale wash and just drop it in. Bring it down the side a little bit where it goes under the bowl. It's very subtle. Soften it, and then drop in a little bit more where the petals meet. And I'm going to do the same thing to the petal on top, especially around where that little stem comes out. Soften. And then drop in a little bit more at the edge. So all that did, it's very, very subtle, because remember, these are really pale. See? It just added a tiny, tiny bit of dimension to it, not too much. In fact, I really think it could use a little more. So I'm going to take more of the wood violet mix, add a little bit of mimosa to it to gray it out. Sort of this murky yellow color. And I'm going to do that again. I'm just going to drop it in right where it comes in. And I can go around at this point because I know what I'm doing. So I'm just going around all of those inner places where the flowers come together. And if I need to, I can clean my brush and dry it off and just sort of flick through to soften. That's it. That's better. A little tiny bit more in here. So you can keep adjusting. As long as it's wet, you can add more. And I'm happy with that too. Okay, so now I think that we're going to add a little bit more of this murkier gray right here in the centers, up the sides of that stem. See that? It just makes that stem stand out. And then use our brush just to sort of pull it down to either side. And now we're going to go around that stem where it looks like it's meeting the center of the bowl. I call it a bowl because it really is kind of a bowl. And then the last thing we're going to do on the inside is we're going to add some spots. And I'm just going to take wood violet and a little bit more bois de rose, just to sort of warm it up a little bit. And with the very, very tip of my brush, I'm going to put some little dots. Only on the inside. Now, we have to think about that stem. And what I want to do is I want to wake up my green again. So it's not just, you don't even have to, you can start fresh, but mostly we want to start with mimosa and add just a tiny bit of green to make it the palest yellow-green possible. Really a yellow-green. See that? So mimosa and viridian, mostly mimosa. And I'm going to get some on the tip of my brush. I'm going to dry my brush off a little bit. We don't want a really, really wet brush. And, oops, I'm just going to paint a little bit down the center of that stem. And that, just to give it a little color, just a little bit. So I see that this here dried a little bit hard, so I can go in and I can just take my brush and just sort of work, soften it just a little bit. Okay. Now our petals need a little bit more work. So we're going to make more of that sort of murky color. So we'll take whatever's left of our wood violet, even just a little touch of wood violet in your palette, with a little bit of yellow to gray it up. You don't want it to be too yellow, so you can always add a touch more of the wood violet until you get kind of this, see, it's kind of a murky, muddy gray, but it's very pale. Make sure our brush has lots of it on there, and then roll your brush to a point with the paint on the brush. And all we're going to do is we're going to start in the center, and we're going to make little tiny lines. We're just going to flick our brush through with this pale paint, starting at the center and then following the curve of the flower, so we get some little pale lines. So there's one petal. I want to show you this. Pretty simple. See, they're just really pale lines going from the center out and then following the curve of the petal. So grab some more of it, roll my brush off a little bit, turn my paper, and it's the same thing. And I'm following the curve of the petal. That's it. And then over here I'm going to do the same. I'm going to follow the curve of the petal. So I just have some little lines in there, and then I'm going to do the same thing with that really pale green that we mixed. So we'll get more of that pale green on our brush. If we need to mix a little more, but just really pale. These are they're almost watery. And the same thing, I'm just going to go in between the lines I did before. And drop this really pale greenish color. I'm just kind of going in between the lines I had before. So I know this probably seems a little fussy, but I know you can do it. And I also know that if you're really a beginner and you haven't done much watercolor yet, it's going to take you more than one try to do this, okay? And that's okay. So one last thing, I'm going to take some wood violet and just put it in my palette so it's not too dark. Get it on my brush, roll my brush to a point, and I'm just going to go around the edge here again. I'm just dabbing the wood violet around the outer edge. I'm just dabbing it right along the outer edge, really lightly, just to give that a little more emphasis. Pick up more of that murky color we keep making. And again, just sort of emphasize the sides of our stem. And where our flowers meet. Our flower petals meet. Sometimes we have to put more than one layer. We don't want to go too dark. You know, it's better to go lighter and then go dark later. So that is a very simple lady slipper. And for one final thing, what we could do is we could just take the water rose, put it in our palette, and make it nice and watery, so it's like a glaze, and it becomes this beautiful pearly peachy pink color. So I'm going to get my brush full of it, dry my brush off a little bit, and I'm going to paint the outer edge very, very carefully of the bowl. I'm just going to put this glaze on top very, very lightly, right on top. And if anything is still too wet, wait for it to dry before you do this, but I painted fairly dry, so it's okay. And I'm just dropping it on top. And that's just giving it a little bit of color. And it's beautiful. All right, so that is my lovely lady slipper. All right, I hope you guys enjoyed this. Let me just hold it up for you again, and the picture will also be posted on Instagram, so you can see that. It's very delicate and lovely. All right, I hope you enjoyed this, and I will see you next time for another Art is for Everyone video, probably early next week. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.